Can you imagine a secret so dangerous, so deeply buried within the confines of a prisoner of war camp, that its exposure could rewrite history? October 27, 1944, 23:17 hours. Camp Hereford, Texas. The air hung thick and heavy with the smell of dust and desperation. A lone coyote howled in the distance, its mournful cry swallowed by the vast, indifferent plains. Inside the barbed wire fence, the camp was a grid of dimly lit barracks, each housing hundreds of German prisoners of war. The silence was deceptive, a brittle facade masking the simmering tensions within. Private First Class Robert Hayes, a guard barely out of his teens, patrolled the perimeter. The wind whipped at his face, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a long, cold night. He clutched his rifle, the metal cold against his gloved hands, and tried to focus on the task at hand. Boredom was his greatest enemy, the relentless monotony that could lull a guard into complacency. He'd heard stories of escapes, of daring attempts foiled by sheer luck or a vigilant eye. He wasn't about to become one of those stories. He paused near Barracks C, the designated quarters for the newly arrived prisoners. A faint light flickered through a crack in the wooden wall. Hayes frowned. Lights out was an hour ago. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He pressed his ear against the wall, straining to hear. Muffled voices, speaking in hushed German, drifted through the crack. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, conspiratorial. Hayes reached for his whistle, ready to alert the other guards, but something stopped him. A word, spoken clearly in the midst of the murmur, caught his attention: Schneiderkunst. Tailoring, intrigued, Hayes hesitated. He knew a little German, enough to understand basic commands and insults. Tailoring seemed harmless enough. Still, regulations were regulations. He raised his whistle again, then lowered it. He decided to take a peek. He carefully positioned himself so he could peer through the crack in the wall. The scene inside the barracks was dimly lit by a makeshift lamp fashioned from a tin can and some salvaged oil. A small group of prisoners huddled around a table, their faces etched with shadows. In the center of the group sat a man, older than the others, with weary eyes and a haunted expression. He was meticulously examining a piece of fabric, his fingers tracing its weave with practiced precision. Hayes recognized him. It was Wilhelm Schmidt, a former tailor from Hamburg. He'd been assigned to Barracks C just 3 days prior. He was a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself and rarely spoke to the other prisoners. Hayes had even felt a pang of sympathy for him, seeing the sadness in his eyes. But what was he doing with that fabric? Hayes squinted, trying to get a better look. The fabric was dark, almost black, and appeared to be a piece of a uniform. It was difficult to make out any details in the dim light, but Hayes thought he could see the faint outline of an insignia. As Schmidt continued his examination, another prisoner spoke up. His voice was sharp, impatient. "Well, Schmidt." "Do you see?" Schmidt didn't answer immediately. He ran his fingers over the fabric again, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and recognition. "This," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is no ordinary uniform." The other prisoners leaned in closer, their faces tense with anticipation. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. Schmidt hesitated, as if afraid to speak the words aloud. "This is the work of Hugo Boss," he said finally. "And it's not just any Hugo Boss uniform. This is a uniform made for an officer of the Schutzstaffel." The Schutzstaffel, the SS, the most feared and ruthless organization in the Third Reich. A collective gasp went through the group. The atmosphere in the barracks shifted, becoming thick with apprehension. Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. What was an SS officer's uniform doing in a prisoner of war camp? "But how is this possible?" one of the prisoners asked, his voice trembling. "All just soldiers here." Schmidt shook his head. "Not all of us," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Someone here is not who he seems to be." Hayes felt a surge of adrenaline. This was no ordinary violation of camp rules. This was something far more sinister. He had stumbled upon a secret, a conspiracy that could have far-reaching consequences. He had to find out who this SS officer was and what he was planning. He crept away from the barracks, his mind racing. He couldn't report this to his superiors. Not yet. He needed more information, more proof. He had to investigate this himself. The next morning, Hayes began his investigation. He started by observing Schmidt, the former tailor. He watched him closely during meals, during work details, during every moment he could. Schmidt continued to keep to himself, avoiding contact with the other prisoners. He seemed to be living in a state of constant fear, always looking over his shoulder. Hayes also paid closer attention to the other prisoners in barracks. He tried to identify anyone who might be an SS officer in disguise. It was a difficult task. The prisoners all wore the same drab uniforms, their heads shaved, their faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. They were a sea of anonymity, making it nearly impossible to distinguish one from another. Days turned into weeks, and Hayes's investigation yielded little progress. He found no concrete evidence to support Schmidt's claim. He began to doubt himself, to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe Schmidt was just a paranoid old man, seeing shadows where there were none. But then something happened that reignited Hayes's suspicions. During a routine roll call, one of the prisoners in Barracks C collapsed. He fell to the ground, convulsing violently. The camp doctor rushed to his side, but it was too late. The prisoner was dead. Official cause of death was listed as heart failure, brought on by malnutrition and exhaustion, but Hayes wasn't convinced. He had seen the prisoner just hours before, and he had seemed perfectly healthy. He suspected that something else had killed him, something that the camp authorities were trying to cover up. He decided to take a closer look at the dead prisoner's belongings. He waited until nightfall, then snuck into the camp morgue. The body lay on a cold metal slab, covered by a white sheet. Hayes pulled back the sheet, revealing the prisoner's face. It was a young man, no older than Hayes himself. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Hayes searched the prisoner's pockets, finding nothing of interest. Then he noticed something unusual about the prisoner's left hand. There was a small, almost invisible tattoo on his wrist. It was a symbol, a series of lines and angles that Hayes didn't recognize. He carefully copied the symbol onto a piece of paper, then left the morgue, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a feeling that this symbol was the key to unlocking the mystery of the SS officer in the prisoner of war camp. The next day, Hayes showed the symbol to Schmidt, the former tailor. Schmidt's eyes widened in fear when he saw it. "Where did you see this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "On the wrist of the prisoner who died," Hayes said. Schmidt took a deep breath. "This is a sign of the Ahnenerbe," he said, "a secret society within the SS dedicated to the study of ancient history and the occult." Hayes frowned. "The occult? What does that have to do with anything?" The Ahnenerbe were obsessed with finding ancient artifacts and using them to achieve world domination, Schmidt said. They believed that they could harness the power of these artifacts to create a master race. Hayes stared at Schmidt in disbelief. "You're saying that this SS officer is part of some kind of occult conspiracy?" "I don't know for sure," Schmidt said, "but I do know that the Ahnenerbe were extremely dangerous. If one of them is hiding in this camp, we're all in danger." Hayes realized that he was dealing with something far more complex and sinister than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just trying to uncover the identity of an SS officer. He was trying to unravel a conspiracy that reached into the darkest corners of the Nazi regime. He knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. But who could he trust? He couldn't go to his superiors. They would think he was crazy. He needed someone who understood the dangers of the SS, someone who was willing to risk everything to expose the truth. He thought of Sergeant Miller, a seasoned veteran who had served in Europe for years. Miller was a tough, no-nonsense soldier, but he was also fair and honest. Hayes had always respected him. He decided to take a chance and confide in him. That evening, Hayes approached Miller in the mess hall. He told him everything he had learned, from the SS officer's uniform to the Ahnenerbe symbol. Miller listened patiently, his face expressionless. When Hayes finished, Miller didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at Hayes, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and concern. Finally, he spoke. "Hayes," he said, "I appreciate you coming to me with this, but what you're saying is pretty far-fetched. An SS officer hiding in a prisoner of war camp, an occult conspiracy, it sounds like something out of a movie." "I know it sounds crazy," Hayes said, "but I swear it's all true. I've seen the evidence myself." Miller sighed. "Look, Hayes, I believe you think you saw these things, but you're young, you're impressionable, you've probably just let your imagination run wild." "But what about the prisoner who died?" Hayes asked. "Don't you think it's suspicious that he died so suddenly?" "People die in prisoner of war camps, Hayes," Miller said. "It's a fact of life. They're malnourished, they're exhausted, they're under constant stress. It's not surprising that one of them would have a heart attack." Hayes felt a surge of frustration. He had hoped that Miller would believe him, but he had been wrong. Miller was just like everyone else, too blind to see the truth. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Hayes said. "I'm just asking you to help me investigate. Just take a look at the symbol, talk to Schmidt, see for yourself if what I'm saying is true." Miller hesitated for a moment, then sighed again. "All right, Hayes," he said. "I'll look into it, but if I don't find anything, I want you to drop it. You understand?" "Yes, sir," Hayes said. "Thank you, Sergeant Miller." The next day, Miller began his own investigation. He started by questioning the other guards in barracks. He asked them if they had noticed anything unusual about the prisoners, if they had seen anyone acting suspiciously. But the guards all said the same thing. The prisoners were just like any other prisoners, quiet and compliant. Miller then talked to Schmidt, the former tailor. Schmidt repeated his story about the SS officer's uniform and the Arnanab symbol. Miller listened carefully, but he remained skeptical. "Mr. Schmidt," he said, "I appreciate you sharing this information with me, but I have to be honest with you, I find it hard to believe. You're telling me that there's an SS officer hiding in this camp and that he's involved in some kind of occult conspiracy. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale." Schmidt shook his head. "It's not a fairy tale, Sergeant Miller," he said. "It's real, I know it is. I've seen the evidence myself." Miller sighed. "All right, Mr. Schmidt," he said. "Thank you for your time." Miller left Schmidt's barracks, feeling more confused than ever. He didn't know what to believe. On the one hand, Hayes and Schmidt seemed genuinely convinced that something sinister was going on. On the other hand, their story seemed so far-fetched, so unbelievable. He decided to consult with the camp doctor, Dr. Albright. Albright was a respected physician, known for his intelligence and his level-headedness. Miller figured he could offer a rational perspective on the situation. He found Albright in his office, examining a stack of medical records. Miller explained the situation to him, telling him about Hayes's suspicions and Schmidt's claims. Albright listened attentively, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Miller finished, Albright leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Sergeant Miller," he said, "I understand your concern, but I have to agree with you, this sounds highly improbable. The idea of an SS officer hiding in this camp, involved in an occult conspiracy, is simply not realistic." "But what about the prisoner who died?" Miller asked. "Don't you think it's suspicious that he died so suddenly?" Albright shook his head. "As I told you before, Sergeant Miller, people die in prisoner-of-war camps. It's a sad reality, but it's a reality nonetheless. The prisoner in question was malnourished and exhausted. It's not surprising that he succumbed to heart failure." Miller felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He had hoped that Albright would be able to shed some light on the situation, but he had only confirmed his own doubts. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Albright," Miller said. "You're welcome, Sergeant Miller," Albright said. "And please don't let this consume you. You have more important things to worry about." Miller left Albright's office, feeling defeated. He had tried to investigate Hayes's claims, but he had found nothing to support them. He was convinced that Hayes was simply mistaken, that he had let his imagination run wild. He returned to Hayes and told him his findings. "Hayes," he said, "I've looked into your claims and I've found nothing to support them. I think you're mistaken. I want you to drop this and focus on your duties." Hayes stared at Miller in disbelief. "But Sergeant Miller," he said, "I know what I saw. I know there's something going on in this camp." "I understand that you believe that, Hayes," Miller said. "But I'm telling you, you're wrong. There's nothing going on here. Just drop it." Hayes felt a surge of anger and frustration. He knew that Miller was wrong, but he couldn't convince him otherwise. He was alone, facing a conspiracy that no one else believed in. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He would continue his investigation, even if he had to do it alone. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. That night, Hayes snuck into barracks. He waited until the prisoners were asleep, then carefully searched their belongings. He was looking for anything that might connect one of them to the SS or the Arnanab. He searched for hours, but he found nothing of interest. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something unusual under one of the prisoners' bunks. It was a small wooden box, hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Hayes carefully pulled the box out and opened it. Inside, he found a collection of strange objects. There was a compass, a map, a small metal amulet, and a diary. Hayes picked up the diary and began to read. It was written in German, in a neat, precise hand. As he read, his eyes widened in shock. The diary was filled with detailed descriptions of occult rituals, references to ancient artifacts, and coded messages. Hayes realized that he had stumbled upon something truly significant. He had found proof of the SS officer's involvement in the Arnanab. He had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the Nazi regime. He carefully closed the diary and put it back in the box. He knew that he had to get this information to someone who could understand it, someone who could take action. He thought of a woman he had met a few weeks earlier. Her name was Sarah, and she was a nurse who worked at the camp hospital. She was intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely independent. Hayes had been drawn to her from the moment he met her. He knew that Sarah was a risk-taker, that she wouldn't be afraid to challenge authority. He decided to confide in her, to show her the diary and the other objects he had found. The next day, Hayes sought out Sarah at the hospital. He told her everything he had learned, from the SS officer's uniform to the Arnanab symbol to the diary he had found in barracks. Sarah listened intently, her face growing increasingly pale as Hayes spoke. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at Hayes, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Hayes," she said finally, "this is incredible. If what you're saying is true, this could have huge implications." "I know," Hayes said. "That's why I came to you. I need your help. I need you to help me get this information to the right people." Sarah nodded. "I'll do everything I can," she said, "but we have to be careful. If the SS officer finds out that we know, he'll stop at nothing to silence us." Hayes and Sarah began to work together, meticulously translating the diary and deciphering the coded messages. They discovered that the SS officer was planning a secret mission, a daring attempt to retrieve an ancient artifact hidden somewhere in the United States. The artifact, according to the diary, was a powerful relic, capable of granting its possessor unimaginable power. The Arnanab believed that this artifact could turn the tide of the war, giving the Nazis the victory they so desperately craved. Hayes and Sarah knew that they had to stop the SS officer. They had to find the artifact before he did, and prevent him from unleashing its power upon the world, but they were running out of time. The SS officer was growing increasingly suspicious, and he was closing in on them. They knew that they had to act quickly before it was too late. One evening, as Hayes and Sarah were poring over the diary, they discovered a crucial clue. It was a map, hidden within the pages of the diary. The map showed a remote location in the Arizona desert, marked with a strange symbol. Hayes and Sarah realized that this was the location of the ancient artifact. They knew that they had to go there to find the artifact before the SS officer did. They made a plan to escape the camp and travel to Arizona. It was a risky plan, but they knew that it was their only chance to stop the SS officer and prevent him from unleashing the artifact's power. The night of the escape, Hayes and Sarah met at a prearranged location near the camp fence. They were armed with nothing but their wits and their determination. They carefully cut through the barbed wire fence and slipped into the darkness. They made their way across the open fields, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the edge of the camp and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the world of the prisoner of war camp and venturing into the unknown. Back in Camp Hereford, the SS officer, whose real name was revealed in the diary to be Obersturmbannführer Klaus Richter, paced impatiently in his barrack. He sensed that something was amiss. He had noticed Hayes's suspicious behavior, and he had seen Sarah's furtive glances. He knew that they were onto him, that they were closing in on his secret. He had to act quickly before they exposed him. He summoned his trusted lieutenant, a ruthless killer named Hans, and ordered him to find Hayes and Sarah. "They know too much," Richter said. "They must be silenced permanently." Hans nodded grimly. "It will be done, Obersturmbannführer," he said. "They will not escape us." Hans gathered a group of loyal followers and set out in pursuit of Hayes and Sarah. The hunt was on. Meanwhile, Hayes and Sarah were driving through the Arizona desert, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They were exhausted, hungry, and terrified, but they were determined to reach the location marked on the map. As they drove, they noticed a black car following them. It was Hans and his men. They were being pursued. Hayes and Sarah knew that they were in grave danger. They had to find a way to escape their pursuers, to reach the artifact before it was too late. They turned off the main road and onto a dirt track, hoping to lose their pursuers in the maze of canyons and mesas. But Hans and his men were relentless. They stayed on their tail, closing in with every mile. Finally, Hayes and Sarah reached the location marked on the map. It was a hidden cave, nestled in the side of a towering mesa. They jumped out of the car and raced towards the cave, hoping to find refuge inside. But as they reached the entrance to the cave, they were confronted by Richter himself. He was standing there, blocking their path, a Luger pistol in his hand. "So," Richter said, his voice dripping with menace, "you thought you could escape me? You thought you could stop me from fulfilling my destiny?" Hayes and Sarah stood their ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that they were facing a formidable enemy, a ruthless killer who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. "We're not afraid of you, Richter," Hayes said, his voice trembling but firm. "We know what you're planning. We know about the artifact, and we're not going to let you get your hands on it." Richter laughed, a cold, chilling sound that echoed through the desert. "You can't stop me," he said. "I am destined to possess the artifact. I am destined to change the course of history." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Hayes's head. "Now," he said, "it's time for you to die." Suddenly, a shot rang out. Richter staggered back, clutching his chest. He looked down in disbelief, seeing the blood gushing from the wound. He turned around and saw Sarah standing behind him, a smoking pistol in her hand. She had shot him. Richter fell to the ground, his eyes filled with hatred and rage. He gasped for breath, his lifeblood draining away. Hayes rushed to Sarah's side, his heart filled with relief and gratitude. "You saved my life," he said. Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "We have to find the artifact," she said. "We have to stop him even in death." Hayes and Sarah entered the cave, their eyes scanning the darkness. They knew that the artifact was hidden somewhere inside, waiting to be discovered. They ventured deeper into the cave, their footsteps echoing through the silent chambers. They passed strange rock formations, ancient carvings, and eerie shadows. Finally, they reached a large chamber, illuminated by a single ray of sunlight that pierced through a crack in the ceiling. In the center of the chamber, resting on a stone pedestal, was the artifact. It was a small, intricately carved box, made of an unknown metal. It glowed with a faint, ethereal light. Hayes and Sarah approached the box cautiously, their hearts filled with awe and trepidation. As Hayes reached out to touch the box, he noticed something strange about the walls of the chamber. There were symbols carved into the stone, symbols that he recognized from the diary. He realized that these symbols were not just decorations. They were part of a complex locking mechanism designed to protect the artifact from intruders. He looked more closely at the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. He remembered a passage from the diary, a passage that described the key to unlocking the chamber. He recited the passage aloud, speaking the ancient words in a clear, confident voice. As he spoke, the symbols on the walls began to glow, emitting a blinding light. The chamber began to shake, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Hayes and Sarah braced themselves, fearing the worst. Suddenly, the stone pedestal began to move, slowly descending into the ground. The artifact disappeared from view, swallowed by the earth. Hayes and Sarah stared in disbelief, their faces etched with confusion. Where had the artifact gone? What had happened? Then they heard a sound, a low, rumbling noise that echoed through the cave. It was coming from below, from the depths of the earth. They looked down and saw a crack forming in the floor of the chamber. The crack widened, growing larger and larger, until it revealed a dark, gaping hole. From the hole, a staircase emerged, leading down into the darkness. Hayes and Sarah stared into the abyss, their hearts filled with dread. What was down there? What secrets were hidden beneath the earth? What dangers awaited them in the darkness? Hayes took a deep breath and stepped onto the staircase, Sarah following close behind. They began to descend, their footsteps echoing through the silent chambers. As they descended, the air grew colder, the darkness deeper. They could hear strange noises, whispers and groans that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cave. Finally, they reached the bottom of the staircase. They found themselves in a vast, underground chamber, illuminated by a strange, phosphorescent light. In the center of the chamber, they saw something that made their blood run cold. It was a massive altar, covered in bloodstains. And chained to the altar was a man. The man was naked, his body covered in cuts and bruises. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth gagged with a piece of cloth. Hayes and Sarah rushed to the man's side, their hearts filled with compassion. They began to untie him, to free him from his bonds. As they untied him, the man looked up at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He tried to speak, but the gag prevented him from making any sound. Hayes carefully removed the gag from the man's mouth. The man took a deep breath and spoke, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Get out of here," he whispered. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You have to leave before it's too late." Hayes and Sarah stared at the man in confusion. "What do you mean?" Hayes asked. "What's going on here?" The man shook his head, his eyes filled with terror. "They're coming," he said. "They're almost here. You have to go now." Suddenly, they heard a sound, a chanting coming from the depths of the chamber. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, spoken in an ancient language. The chanting grew louder and louder, until it filled the entire chamber. The ground began to shake, the air grew thick with anticipation. Then from the shadows they emerged. Figures cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden from view. They were carrying torches, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The figures surrounded Hayes and Sarah, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They began to chant, their voices rising to a crescendo. Hayes and Sarah realized that they were in grave danger. They had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that they couldn't possibly understand. They tried to fight back, but it was no use. The figures were too powerful, too numerous. They were quickly overwhelmed. The figures seized Hayes and Sarah and dragged them towards the altar. They threw them onto the bloodstained surface, chaining them to the cold, unforgiving stone. Hayes and Sarah struggled against their bonds, their hearts filled with terror. They knew what was coming. They knew that they were about to become sacrifices offered to some dark and ancient god. The figures raised their torches, illuminating the chamber with an unearthly glow. They began to chant again, their voices filled with a bloodthirsty fervor. Then one of the figures stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his cloak made of black velvet. He raised his hands, gesturing towards the heavens. "We call upon thee," he said, his voice booming through the chamber. "We offer thee these sacrifices, that thou may grant us thy power." He turned to Hayes and Sarah, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Prepare to meet your maker," he said. He raised a dagger, its blade glinting in the torchlight. He was about to plunge it into Hayes's chest when suddenly, the man who had been chained to the altar before lunged forward. With a surprising burst of strength, he broke free from his bonds and tackled the figure with the dagger. The two men fell to the ground, wrestling for control of the weapon. Hayes and Sarah watched in disbelief, their hearts filled with a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare, but then something even more shocking happened. The man who had tackled the figure with the dagger suddenly stopped fighting. He looked up at Hayes and Sarah, his eyes filled with a strange, almost pleading expression. Then he spoke, his voice clear and strong. "I'm sorry," he said, "but this is the only way." He grabbed the dagger and plunged it into his own chest. He fell to the ground, dead. The figures gasped in surprise, their chanting faltering. They stared at the dead man in confusion, their faces etched with disbelief. Then the figure in the black velvet cloak stepped forward. He knelt down beside the dead man and examined his body. He looked up at the other figures, his eyes filled with rage. "He was one of us," he said. "He was a traitor." He turned to Hayes and Sarah, his eyes burning with hatred. "You," he said, "you will pay for this." He raised his dagger again, preparing to strike. But as he raised the dagger, he noticed something strange about the dead man's hand. Clutched tightly in his fist was a small piece of paper. The figure carefully pried the paper from the dead man's grasp and unfolded it. He read the words written on the paper, his eyes widening in shock. He stared at Hayes and Sarah, his face filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Can't be," he said. "It's impossible." He turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. The other figures followed him, their chanting silenced, their torches extinguished. Hayes and Sarah were left alone, chained to the altar in the darkness. They stared at each other in confusion, their minds reeling. What had just happened? What had the dead man written on that piece of paper? What had the figure seen that had terrified him so? They strained against their bonds, desperate to escape, to find out the truth. They were trapped, helpless and alone. As the minutes ticked by, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, the silence more profound. Hayes and Sarah could feel the weight of the ancient evil pressing down on them, threatening to consume them. Then suddenly they heard a sound, a faint scratching noise coming from behind the altar. They strained their ears, trying to make out the source of the sound. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then a section of the wall behind the altar slid open, revealing a hidden passage. From the passage, a figure emerged. It was an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes filled with wisdom and compassion. She was carrying a lantern, its light casting a warm glow on her face. She approached Hayes and Sarah, her movements slow but deliberate. She began to untie them, her fingers nimble and sure. As she untied them, she spoke, her voice soft and soothing. "Be afraid," she said. "I'm here to help you." Hayes and Sarah stared at the old woman in disbelief, their hearts filled with hope. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she helping them? The old woman smiled, her eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "I'm a friend," she said, "and I know the way out of here." She led Hayes and Sarah through the hidden passage, deeper into the earth. As they walked, she told them her story. She was a descendant of an ancient tribe, a tribe that had guarded the artifact for centuries. She knew its secrets, its powers, and its dangers. She had been waiting for them, she said. She knew that they would come. She knew that they were the only ones who could stop the evil that was about to be unleashed. They reached the end of the passage and emerged into a hidden valley, bathed in the light of the moon. The valley was lush and green, a stark contrast to the barren desert they had left behind. The old woman led them to a small cottage, nestled among the trees. She invited them inside, offering them food and shelter. As they ate, she told them what they had to do. They had to destroy the artifact, she said. It was too dangerous to be left in the hands of men. Hayes and Sarah listened intently, their faces etched with determination. They knew that it would be a difficult and dangerous task, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They spent the night in the cottage, resting and preparing for their journey. The next morning they set out, accompanied by the old woman. They traveled for days, across mountains and deserts, following the old woman's guidance. They faced countless obstacles, but they persevered, their spirits unbroken. Finally, they reached their destination. It was a remote volcano, its crater filled with molten lava. The old woman told them that this was the only place where the artifact could be destroyed. They had to throw it into the lava to obliterate its power forever. Hayes and Sarah approached the crater, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the heat radiating from the lava, its intensity almost unbearable. They reached the edge of the crater and looked down into the fiery depths. They could see the artifact, glowing faintly amidst the molten rock. Hayes took a deep breath and raised the artifact above his head. He was about to throw it into the lava when suddenly he hesitated. He looked at the artifact, its intricate carvings, its mysterious glow. He couldn't help but wonder about its power, its potential. What if instead of destroying it, they could use it? What if they could harness its power for good? He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can do this," he said. "What if we're making a mistake?" Sarah looked at Hayes, her eyes filled with understanding. She knew what he was thinking. She had felt the same temptation herself, but she also knew that the artifact was too dangerous to be left in the hands of mortals. As a force of nature, a power that could corrupt even the purest of hearts, she reached out and took Hayes's hand. "We have to do this," she said, "for the good of the world." Hayes nodded, his face set with determination. He turned back to the crater and threw the artifact into the lava. The artifact disappeared from view, swallowed by the fiery depths. A wave of heat washed over them, followed by a deafening roar, then silence. The volcano fell silent, its power extinguished. The artifact was gone. Hayes and Sarah looked at each other, their faces etched with relief. They had done it. They had saved the world. They turned and walked away from the volcano, leaving behind the ancient evil and venturing into a new era of peace and prosperity, or so they thought. Back in Camp Hereford, a lone figure emerged from the shadows. It was Dr. Albright, the camp doctor. He had been watching Hayes and Sarah, following their every move. He knew about the artifact. He knew about their plan to destroy it. And he had a different plan of his own. He approached the volcano, his eyes gleaming with ambition. He knew that the artifact was gone, destroyed by Hayes and Sarah, but he also knew that its power remained. It was still there, dormant, waiting to be awakened. He climbed down into the crater, his boots crunching on the hardened lava. He reached the spot where the artifact had been thrown and began to dig. He dug for hours, his hands blistered and bleeding, but he didn't give up. He knew that he was close. Finally, he felt something solid beneath his fingers. He pulled it out of the lava, revealing a small, charred piece of metal. It was a fragment of the artifact, a tiny piece of its former power. But it was enough. Albright held the fragment in his hand, his eyes filled with triumph. He closed his eyes and began to chant, speaking the ancient words in a low, guttural voice. As he chanted, the fragment began to glow, emitting a faint, ethereal light. Albright could feel its power surging through him, filling him with energy and strength. He opened his eyes, his face transformed. He was no longer Dr. Albright, the mild-mannered camp doctor. He was something else, something more. He was a vessel, a conduit for the power of the artifact. He was ready to unleash its fury upon the world. He raised his hands to the heavens, his eyes blazing with an unholy light. "I am the chosen one," he declared. The world shifted for Albright. The Texas night, the prisoner of war camp, the weight of his failure to stop Hayes and Sarah, all of it faded, replaced by an overwhelming surge of power. He looked out at the camp, no longer seeing it as a prison but as a staging ground. A tremor ran through the barbed wire fence. The guards shifted uneasily in their watchtowers, sensing something was amiss, but unable to articulate the shift in the night. Albright smiled, a predatory curve of his lips that had never been there before. Private Hayes, the young guard who had set these events in motion, was long gone, lost in the vast expanse of the Arizona desert with Nurse Sarah chasing shadows and ancient myths. Albright knew they were fools, blinded by their naive sense of righteousness. They sought to destroy what they couldn't understand, while he, Dr. Albright, saw the true potential, the path to ultimate power. The other prisoners of war, huddled in their barracks, were oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. They dreamt of home, of loved ones, of a life beyond the barbed wire. But their dreams were meaningless now. They were pawns in Albright's game, unwitting participants in a plan far grander and more terrifying than anything they could imagine. Albright, now infused with the artifact's dark energy, began to subtly manipulate events within the camp. He started small, with whispers and suggestions, exploiting the existing tensions between the prisoners. He fanned the flames of resentment, turning them against each other. He knew that chaos was the perfect breeding ground for his plan. A minor outbreak of dysentery swept through Barracks B, a consequence of spoiled rations. The prisoners, already weakened by hunger and confinement, succumbed quickly. Albright, seemingly concerned, offered his medical expertise, but his treatments were subtly different, subtly altered. He used experimental drugs, claiming they were new advances in medicine, but their true purpose was far more sinister. He was testing the prisoners, gauging their resistance to the artifact's energy, preparing them for something far more significant. Sergeant Miller, a man of unwavering duty, sensed the growing unease within the camp. The atmosphere had become toxic, filled with suspicion and paranoia. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was terribly wrong. He tried to address the problems head-on, enforcing discipline and cracking down on dissent, but his efforts were futile. The more he tried to control the situation, the more chaotic it became. One evening, while making his rounds, Miller noticed a group of prisoners gathered in a secluded corner of the yard. They were huddled around a fire, chanting in low voices. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something acrid and unsettling. Miller approached cautiously, demanding to know what they were doing. The prisoners scattered, their faces filled with fear and guilt. Miller extinguished the fire, but the stench lingered in the air. He found a collection of strange objects amidst the ashes, animal bones, feathers, and a crudely drawn symbol that looked vaguely familiar. He brought the objects to Albright, seeking an explanation. Albright examined them with a detached curiosity, feigning ignorance. He dismissed them as harmless superstition, the desperate attempts of men clinging to their old ways in a foreign land. But Miller wasn't convinced. He saw something in Albright's eyes, a flicker of something dark and knowing. He began to investigate the prisoners' activities, questioning them individually, but they clammed up, refusing to speak. They were terrified, their loyalty divided between their fear of the guards and their fear of something else, something far more powerful. Miller confided in a new cook, a woman named Elsa who had recently arrived at the camp. She was quiet and unassuming, but she had a keen eye and a sharp mind. Miller had noticed her subtle observations of the prisoners, her way of listening more than she spoke. He hoped she could shed some light on the strange events unfolding in the camp. Elsa listened patiently to Miller's concerns, her expression unreadable. She admitted that she had noticed the growing tension among the prisoners, but she couldn't explain it. She promised to keep her eyes open, to report anything suspicious. A few days later, Elsa approached Miller with a troubled expression. She had overheard a conversation between two prisoners in the kitchen. They were speaking in code, using obscure references and veiled threats. She couldn't understand the specifics, but she sensed that they were planning something dangerous. She had managed to remember a few key phrases, repeating them to Miller. "The serpent sleeps but dreams," and "the black sun rises at dawn." Miller, desperate for any kind of lead, wrote the phrases down. He felt certain that these phrases were connected to the strange symbols and rituals he had witnessed. As Miller delved deeper into the mystery, he found himself increasingly isolated. The other guards dismissed his concerns as paranoia, fueled by stress and exhaustion. His superiors cautioned him to focus on maintaining order, to avoid stirring up trouble, but Miller couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He was convinced that the prisoner of war camp was on the brink of chaos. He knew that he had to act, but he didn't know where to turn. He considered contacting the military intelligence, but he feared that his claims would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. He needed solid evidence, irrefutable proof of the conspiracy that was unfolding within the camp. One night, Miller decided to search Albright's office. He knew it was a risky move, but he was desperate for answers. He waited until the camp was quiet, then snuck into the doctor's quarters. The office was sparsely furnished, but meticulously organized. Medical books lined the shelves, and charts and diagrams covered the walls. Miller searched the drawers and cabinets, finding nothing but routine medical supplies and paperwork. He was about to give up when he noticed a small, locked box hidden beneath a pile of files. He tried to open it, but it was firmly secured. He rummaged through the office, searching for a key. After what seemed like an eternity, he found a key hidden inside a medical textbook. He carefully inserted it into the lock and turned. The box clicked open. Inside, Miller found a collection of strange and disturbing objects. There was a human skull, its eye sockets filled with dried herbs. There was a silver amulet, engraved with a symbol that resembled a serpent coiled around a sun. And there was a diary, bound in leather and filled with cryptic entries written in German. Miller recognized the symbol on the amulet. It was the same symbol that he had found amidst the ashes of the prisoner's fire. He felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that he had stumbled upon something truly evil. He opened the diary and began to read. The entries were written in a dense, academic style, filled with references to ancient mythology, occult rituals, and forbidden knowledge. Miller struggled to decipher the meaning, but he understood enough to realize that Albright was involved in something far more sinister than he could have imagined. The diary spoke of harnessing the power of ancient artifacts, of manipulating the forces of nature, of achieving a state of enlightenment through ritualistic sacrifice. It detailed Albright's obsession with the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research organization dedicated to exploring the occult. Miller discovered that Albright believed he was chosen, destined to unlock the secrets of the artifact that Hayes and Sarah had sought to destroy. He believed that the fragment he had recovered from the volcano was the key to unlocking untold power. The diary revealed that Albright was planning a ritual, a ceremony that would harness the artifact's energy and transform him into something more than human. The ritual was to take place on the night of the next full moon, in a secluded location within the camp. Miller knew that he had to stop Albright. He had to prevent the ritual from taking place, or the consequences could be catastrophic. But he was running out of time. The full moon was only a few days away. He left Albright's office, his mind racing. He had to find a way to expose the doctor's plot, to convince someone to believe him. But who could he trust? He thought of Elsa, the cook. She had been a reliable source of information in the past. He decided to confide in her, to show her the diary and the objects he had found. He sought her out in the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. He showed her the evidence, explaining everything he had learned. Elsa listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. She had suspected that Albright was up to something, but she hadn't realized the full extent of his depravity. She agreed to help Miller, but she warned him that it would be dangerous. Albright was a powerful man, and he had many allies within the camp. Together, Miller and Elsa devised a plan to expose Albright's plot. They decided to gather evidence of his activities, to present it to the camp commander, Colonel Parker. They knew that Parker was a pragmatic and rational man. He would need solid proof before he would believe their claims. They had to be careful to avoid arousing Albright's suspicion. They began to monitor Albright's movements, tracking his comings and goings. They discovered that he was making frequent trips to a secluded area in the woods outside the camp, a place that was off-limits to the prisoners. Miller suspected that this was where Albright was planning to conduct his ritual. He decided to investigate the area to see if he could find any evidence of his activities. One night, Miller snuck out of the camp and made his way to the woods. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. He followed a narrow path through the trees, his eyes scanning the shadows. He came to a clearing where he found a circle of stones arranged on the ground. In the center of the circle, there was a makeshift altar stained with blood. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay. Miller knew that he had found Albright's ritual site. He searched the area, finding a collection of strange objects, candles, herbs, and a small wooden box. He opened the box and found a collection of human teeth, arranged in a circle. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He knew that Albright was a monster. He gathered the objects and returned to the camp, his mind filled with dread. He had enough evidence to convince Parker that Albright was a threat. The next morning, Miller and Elsa approached Parker, requesting an urgent meeting. They presented him with the evidence they had gathered, the diary, the amulet, the human teeth. Parker listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He examined the evidence, his brow furrowed in concentration. After what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Sergeant Miller," he said, "this is a very serious accusation. Are you sure about this?" "Yes, sir," Miller said. "I'm absolutely sure Dr. Albright is planning something terrible. We have to stop him," Parker sighed. "I don't know, Sergeant Miller," he said. "This all sounds very far-fetched. Dr. Albright is a respected physician. I find it hard to believe that he would be involved in something like this." "But sir," Elsa said, "we have the evidence. The diary, the amulet, the human teeth." "What more do you need?" Parker hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll look into it. But if I don't find anything to support your claims, I expect you to drop this. You understand?" "Yes, sir," Miller said. "Thank you, Colonel Parker." Parker ordered an investigation into Albright's activities. He assigned a team of guards to monitor his movements, to search his office, and to question his associates. The investigation dragged on for days, but it yielded nothing. The guards found no evidence of any wrongdoing. Albright's office was clean, his associates were loyal, and his movements were perfectly normal. Parker began to doubt Miller's claims. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if he had allowed himself to be swayed by paranoia and superstition. He summoned Miller to his office. "Sergeant Miller," he said, "I'm afraid I have some bad news. The investigation has turned up nothing. There is no evidence to support your claims against Dr. Albright." Miller felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had failed. He had been unable to convince Parker of the truth. "But sir," he said, "I know he's planning something. I've seen the evidence. I've read the diary." Parker shook his head. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Miller," he said, "but I can't act on hunches. I need proof." He paused, then added, "I think it's time for you to take a leave of absence, Sergeant Miller. You're clearly under a lot of stress. You need to rest and recuperate." Miller knew that he was being dismissed, that Parker no longer believed him. He left the office, his heart filled with bitterness and resentment. He returned to Elsa, his face etched with defeat. He told her what had happened, how Parker had dismissed his claims. Elsa listened sympathetically, her eyes filled with concern. She knew that Miller was devastated, that he had lost all hope. "Give up, Miller," she said. "We can still stop him. We just have to find another way." Miller looked at Elsa, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. He knew that she was right. They couldn't give up. They had to keep fighting, even if they were alone. They decided to take matters into their own hands. They would continue to monitor Albright's movements, to gather evidence of his plot. They would do whatever it took to stop him, even if it meant risking their lives. The night of the full moon arrived, casting an eerie glow over the prisoner of war camp. Albright prepared for his ritual, his heart filled with anticipation. He gathered the necessary ingredients, the candles, the herbs, the blood. He made his way to the secluded clearing in the woods, his movements shrouded in secrecy. He lit the candles, casting a flickering light on the altar. He arranged the herbs and the blood in a precise pattern. He took a deep breath and began to chant, speaking the ancient words in a low, guttural voice. The air grew thick with energy, the ground began to tremble. He closed his eyes and focused his mind, visualizing the power of the artifact flowing through him. He could feel its energy surging through his veins, transforming him into something more than human. He opened his eyes, his face transformed. He was no longer Dr. Albright, the mild-mannered camp doctor. He was a vessel, a conduit for the power of the artifact. He raised his hands to the heavens, his eyes blazing with an unholy light. "I am the chosen one," he declared. "I am the master of all." Suddenly he heard a voice. "That's where you're wrong, Albright." Albright turned around and saw Miller and Elsa standing at the edge of the clearing. They were armed with rifles, their faces set with determination. "You can't stop me," Albright said, his voice filled with arrogance. "I am too powerful." "You'll see about that," Miller said. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Albright in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. After a cold, chilling sound that echoed through the woods. "You can't kill me," he said. "I am immortal." He raised his hands and unleashed a wave of energy, sending Miller and Elsa flying backwards. They crashed to the ground, their rifles clattering to the earth. Albright approached them, his eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Now," he said, "it's time for you to die." He raised his hands, preparing to unleash another wave of energy. But before he could act, Elsa stood up, revealing an object in her hands. It was a small, intricately carved box made of an unknown metal. It glowed with a faint, ethereal light. Albright stared at the box in disbelief. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Elsa smiled. "I've been waiting a long time for this," she said. She opened the box, revealing its contents. Inside there was a single object, a piece of volcanic rock pulsating with energy. Albright recognized the rock. It was a fragment of the artifact, the same artifact that he had been trying to harness. But this fragment was different. It was pure, untainted by the darkness that had corrupted him. Elsa held the fragment aloft, her eyes closed, her face filled with serenity. She began to chant, speaking the ancient words in a clear, resonant voice. The air grew thick with energy, the ground began to tremble. The fragment began to glow brighter and brighter, emitting a blinding light. Albright screamed, his body writhing in agony. The power of the fragment was tearing him apart, destroying the darkness within him. He fell to the ground, his body convulsing violently. Then he went still, the light faded, the energy dissipated. The woods fell silent. Miller and Elsa stood over Albright's lifeless body, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. They had done it. They had stopped him, but they knew that their journey was far from over. The power of the artifact was still out there, waiting to be harnessed. They had to find a way to destroy it, to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. They left the woods, their hearts filled with hope and determination. They knew that the fate of the world rested on their shoulders. Back in the prisoner of war camp, Colonel Parker surveyed the scene. Albright was dead, his body lying in the clearing. Miller and Elsa stood beside him, their faces pale but resolute. Parker didn't understand what had happened, but he knew that something extraordinary had taken place. He knew that Miller and Elsa had saved the camp, perhaps even the world. He looked at them, his eyes filled with gratitude and respect. "Thank you," he said. "You've done a great service." Miller and Elsa nodded, their faces still etched with exhaustion. They knew that their work was far from over. They had a long journey ahead of them, a journey that would take them to the far corners of the earth. Parker turned to his men. "Take the body away," he said, "and clean up this mess." The guards moved quickly, carrying Albright's body away and clearing the clearing of all traces of the ritual. Parker turned back to Miller and Elsa. "I still don't understand what happened here," he said, "but I trust you. Tell me everything." Miller and Elsa told Parker everything, from the discovery of the diary to the final confrontation with Albright. They explained the power of the artifact, the dangers of the Arnanab, and the importance of destroying it. Parker listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. He realized that he had stumbled upon something far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. He knew that he had to act quickly to inform his superiors about the threat. He contacted the military intelligence, relaying the information he had learned from Miller and Elsa. The intelligence officers were skeptical, but they agreed to investigate. They sent a team of agents to the prisoner of war camp to interview Miller and Elsa and to examine the evidence. The agents spent days at the camp, poring over the diary, examining the amulet, and questioning the prisoners. They gradually came to realize that Miller and Elsa were telling the truth, that Albright had been involved in something truly sinister. The agents reported their findings to their superiors, who were shocked and alarmed. They realized that the threat of the Arnanab was far greater than they had previously imagined. They launched a massive investigation, tracking down Albright's associates, searching for other fragments of the artifact, and attempting to unravel the secrets of the ancient tribe. The investigation led them to a network of Nazi sympathizers scattered across the United States. They discovered that these sympathizers had been providing Albright with resources and information, helping him to carry out his plot. The agents arrested the sympathizers, seizing their assets and shutting down their operations. They also discovered a secret laboratory hidden beneath a deserted warehouse where Albright had been conducting experiments. In the laboratory, they found a collection of strange and disturbing objects: human bones, animal organs, and vials of mysterious liquids. They also found a collection of books and documents detailing Albright's research into the occult. The agents realized that Albright had been trying to create a new type of weapon, a weapon that would harness the power of the artifact and give the Nazis an unbeatable advantage. They destroyed the laboratory, eradicating all traces of Albright's research. They also confiscated all of the books and documents, hoping to learn more about the artifact and its power. The investigation continued for months, but it eventually came to an end. The agents had successfully neutralized the threat of the Arnanab, preventing them from unleashing their power upon the world. Miller and Elsa were hailed as heroes, their bravery and dedication recognized by the highest levels of the military. They were awarded medals for their service, and they were given new assignments, far away from the prisoner of war camp. Miller was assigned to a special intelligence unit, tasked with investigating the occult and preventing future threats. Elsa was assigned to a medical research facility where she could use her skills and knowledge to help others. They left the prisoner of war camp, their hearts filled with pride and gratitude. They knew that they had made a difference, that they had helped to save the world. But they also knew that the fight against evil was never truly over, that there would always be new threats, new challenges to face. They were ready to meet those challenges, to continue their fight for justice and peace. Back in the deserted laboratory, a single object remained. It was a small, unassuming vial, hidden beneath a pile of rubble. The vial contained a clear liquid, shimmering with an unnatural light. It was a sample of Albright's research, a remnant of his twisted experiments. The vial sat untouched, waiting to be discovered, waiting to unleash its power upon an unsuspecting world. Years later, in a forgotten corner of a military archive, a young researcher stumbled upon a file labeled Project Nightingale. Intrigued, she opened the file and began to read. The file contained a detailed account of the events that had transpired at the prisoner of war camp, the story of Albright, Miller, and Elsa. It described the artifact, the Arnanab, and the secret laboratory. The researcher was fascinated by the story, but she couldn't help but feel that something was missing. She sensed that there was more to the story than what was written in the file. She began to investigate, digging deeper into the archives, searching for any clues that might shed light on the mystery. She discovered that the vial from Albright's laboratory had never been accounted for. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. She wondered what had happened to the vial, what secrets it held. She began to suspect that it was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. She decided to track it down, to uncover the truth about Albright's research, to prevent the power of the artifact from falling into the wrong hands. Her investigation led her to a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, a place shrouded in mystery and legend. She discovered that the island was once used as a testing ground for biological weapons, a secret operation conducted by the United States military. She suspected that the vial had been taken to the island to be used in these experiments. She decided to travel to the island to search for the vial, to uncover the truth about its power. She arrived on the island, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was entering a dangerous place, a place where the past was still very much alive. She began to explore the island, her eyes scanning the landscape. She found abandoned bunkers, overgrown laboratories, and decaying equipment. She also found something else, a group of people living in isolation, their bodies strangely mutated. They were the descendants of the soldiers who had worked on the island, exposed to the biological weapons and the power of the artifact. The mutated islanders were hostile, distrustful of outsiders. They attacked the researcher, forcing her to flee for her life. She escaped the island, her mission unfulfilled. She knew that she had to return to find the vial, to protect the world from its power. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone who understood the dangers of the occult, someone who was willing to risk their life for the sake of humanity. She thought of Hayes and Sarah, the young guard and the nurse who had first discovered the truth about Albright. She knew that they were still out there, somewhere, fighting the good fight. She decided to seek them out, to tell them what she had learned, to ask for their help. But as she prepared to leave, she found a note slipped under her door. The note was written in a cryptic code, a code that she recognized from Albright's diary. She deciphered the code, her heart pounding in her chest. The message read, "The serpent sleeps, but its dreams are waking. The black sun rises again." She realized that the forces of evil were still at work, that the artifact's power was still a threat. She knew that she was in grave danger, that she was being watched. She had to be careful, to trust no one. She decided to abandon her plan to seek out Hayes and Sarah. She knew that it would be too risky, that it would put them in danger. She had to find another way, a way to stop the evil that was spreading across the world. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the burden of responsibility. She knew that she was alone, facing a powerful enemy, but she was not afraid. She was determined to fight, to protect the innocent, to save the world. She took a deep breath and stepped out into the darkness, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Deep beneath the Vatican, in a secret archive known only to a handful of high-ranking officials, a cardinal nervously adjusted his spectacles. He held a brittle, centuries-old document in his trembling hands. Its yellowed parchment detailed a prophecy, a warning of a great darkness that would rise again when the serpent's dream aligned with the black sun. He dismissed it as folklore for years, until a coded message landed on his desk. The message spoke of an island, a military experiment gone wrong, and a vial, a relic of a madman's obsession. A relic that the prophecy said would unlock something far worse. His phone buzzed, displaying an encrypted number. He answered, his voice barely a whisper. "Have you found them?" The voice on the other end was cold, professional. "We have located Private Hayes and Nurse Sarah. They are living quiet lives, but they remember everything. They are reluctant to get involved." The cardinal sighed. Reluctant or not, they were the only ones who truly understood the magnitude of the threat. "Bring them in," he commanded, "by any means necessary." He hung up, his gaze returning to the ancient prophecy. The black sun was rising, and the world was about to face a darkness it had long forgotten. Aboard a research vessel cutting through the turbulent waters of the Pacific, a marine biologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, reviewed the sonar readings. An anomaly, a large underwater structure, sat on the ocean floor near the infamous island. The readings suggested that it wasn't natural. He'd convinced the university to fund this expedition, arguing it was a unique geological formation. But he knew deep down it was something else. His grandfather, a veteran of World War II, had whispered stories of the island, of strange experiments and a power that shouldn't exist. He had dismissed them as the ramblings of an old man, until he stumbled upon a declassified file mentioning the name Albright and a project shrouded in secrecy. Thorne felt an irresistible pull, a need to uncover the truth that lay beneath the waves. He turned to his first mate, a grizzled veteran named Ben. "Prepare the submersible," he ordered. "We're going down." Hours later, submerged in the inky blackness, Thorne peered through the viewport. The sonar was right. A massive structure loomed before them, its architecture alien and unsettling. It was constructed of an unknown material, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light of the submersible's lamps. As they approached, a large opening appeared, beckoning them inside. Thorne hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over him. But his curiosity, his need to know, outweighed his fear. "Let's go in," he said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the submersible's engines. Back in Texas, under the wide, indifferent sky, a seemingly ordinary letter arrived at a quiet ranch. The return address was a Washington, D.C. legal firm. The letter's contents were anything but ordinary. The letter simply read, "They know they need you." Inside was an old photograph. Hayes and Sarah, young and hopeful, standing beside the barbed wire fence of Camp Hereford. The past had come calling, and their peaceful lives were about to be shattered.